Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Sandy and Friends. My name is Susan Court. I'm the Development Director for the Hershey Symphony Orchestra, and I'm pleased to welcome you to a wonderful conversation tonight with the Hershey Symphony Orchestra Music Director, Dr. Sandra Dackow, and Dr. Eric Fung from Lebanon Valley College. They are going to be talking about Beethoven as we approach his 250th birthday. We're going to be focusing tonight on his concertos. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome them to the program. And before we get into the conversation, I just want to take a moment to make sure that we're giving a special mention to the generous sponsors who have helped support the Hershey Symphony Orchestra during our 2019 and 2020 season, which of course had to be cut short due to the pandemic. But we want to make sure we're giving a very special thank you to our sponsors, Penn State Health and Highmark, the Hershey Company, McQuaid Blasco, Cornwall Manor, the law offices of Stephen A. Stein, UPMC Pinnacle, Mabel Tang Piano Tuning and Repair, and our bronze sponsors, Hershey Entertainment and Resorts, the Hershey Trust Company, the Hershey Rotary Club, Members First, Country Meadows, and Manja Manja Italian Grill. So a big thank you to our sponsors for continuing to support us. We invite any businesses or patrons to continue to support us in what would have been our 2020-2021 season. We continue to look for unique and meaningful ways to recognize your support, and we will do that in part through our programs called Sandy and Friends. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Sandra Dackow and Dr. Eric Fung. So you take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for all the great work you do as development director for the Hershey Symphony. And a big thank you to everyone who has supported us and continues to stand by us in this pandemic. Our sponsors, for those of you who don't know it, we had an outpouring of generosity from those who bought ads for the entire season. When we canceled the season, people have not been asking for that money to be refunded, nor have most of our, I think almost all of our subscribers. They're just letting it ride, as it were, and waiting to see when we come back and hoping that we are able to reconnect with them soon with live music. So thank you.
They thank you, and they believe in the Hershey Symphony Orchestra, and they want to be a part of our family. And these conversations that we have online are just a wonderful way to continue that outreach. So I thank you for your commitment, and Eric as well for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. I also really want to thank the community really to continue to support the arts through this very difficult time.
You've got that right. Thank you so much, Eric. And this is our way of providing something to tide us over for people who are hungry to be in the midst of music and talk about music and think about music, feeling about music. And when we're done, hopefully they'll run to either their collections of recorded music or the newer technologies that put all of this at their fingertips and listen again and explore some new pieces as well. So last night we talked about sonatas, and a sonata is kind of an intimate piece I don't mean that it has to be performed in an intimate venue, but it can be. In other words, it's generally a solo instrument and a piano, and it doesn't require an orchestra backing them up. So obviously it doesn't have the same space requirements or the same economic requirements, although that was not really an issue in Beethoven's time the way it is today, where we have to figure out a way to pay for an orchestra if we're going to put on a piano concerto. The economics were different back then, but that's a consideration. Sonatas were meant to be done in a small place. They could be done in a small concert hall. They could be done in the living room of a wealthy patron, living rooms such as they were back then, or they could be done with a friend in your own home. And that was beginning to catch on with the previous generation to Beethoven's, Mozart, Haydn, the idea you'd publish music for friends to play in their own home. There were even combinations of master and servants getting together after the day was over and the dishes were washed and put away, and the master might play one instrument and the servants would fill in the others. That's kind of the first steps towards egalitarian in music making. And they would even, I read somewhere, even advertise, we need somebody who can be a butler and a groom of the back staircase, must play cello. And which I think is so cool. So sonatas were on a smaller scale. And Beethoven left us a wealth of sonatas. Your colleague, why am I blanking on his first name? Ken Ozowski from York College, said that the Beethoven sonatas were essentially the New Testament for piano players, and the Bach Well-Tempered Clavier was considered the Old Testament. For those of you who are not familiar with these terms, these are collections of music that represent pinnacles of their type by one composer. The Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach, and he gave us preludes and fugues in all major and minor keys. And in Beethoven, well, he didn't actually try to write in each major and minor key, but the point is he covered an entire landscape of feelings and thoughts and moods and everything else in those 32 sonatas. So let me work backwards. There are 32 sonatas for piano of Beethoven. There are 10 sonatas for violin and piano. And interestingly enough, as I said last night, when Beethoven wrote these, the original publication said for piano with violin obbligato. And the pianoforte of the day, which didn't have any metal in its frame at the time, it was a problem because the violin kept drowning it out. Think about that. Then we go down to the five cello sonatas. Same thing. When they were originally written, the cello would overbalance the piano. Who thought? You know, we today, it's always we have to be very, very sensitive that the pianist doesn't drown us out with exuberance. Okay, and then finally, one sonata for horn and piano. And so we talked about those in our previous show, and everyone who talked about the music for their instrument was passionate about it. But again, these are on a small scale. They might be on a gigantic scale in terms of the thought content and the musical content, as the late piano sonatas, for instance. But you can still perform them by yourself. You can perform them in your studio or in your living room, as well as on a concert stage. Now the concertos, they're a different animal entirely.
Well, Sandy, I want to interrupt you for a second because we have our violin representation here to talk about the concertos, and I wanted to make sure that we got him in the room. So
let's get him in here.
Now joining us. I wanted to bring him in, sneak him in before we got too far into the conversation. So Odin's coming on right now. I want to thank him for taking the time to talk with us this evening. Are you there, Odin?
I am, but I don't see myself. I don't know if you guys can see me.
No, we don't. But there's a button at the bottom that says start video. There you are. Wonderful. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
All
so
right.
I'm just bringing listeners up to speed because we talked about sonatas in our previous broadcast, and the difference between sonatas and concertos is, I'm not going to say exclusively one of scale because it's not. It involves more contrast. It involves certainly numbers of forces that you can't have in an intimate setting. And as we look at the evolution of the concerto, you go back to the Baroque concertos of Vivaldi, you would pit the soloist against the sound of the tutti musicians, and they'd go back and forth. They'd talk to each other, and maybe it would seem like they were trying to compete with each other. So there was that contrast, and also in sort of implied competition. By the time we get to Beethoven, we watch him move from his early piano concertos, 1 and 2, through the more romantic ones that follow. And then we look at the violin concerto, which is in a class by itself. And so that's kind of where we are right now. I'm going to let Dr. Fung start because he's got 5 pieces to kind of react to. And tell us a little bit about those concertos.
Well, it is quite frequently, when people talk about Beethoven piano concerto, we often think about the five. Okay. In fact, believe it or not, there are actually one concerto that is called Concerto Number 0. It was not well. Only the piano part survived, and there's no orchestra part. And some people actually
People have pieced it.
reconstructed. Right.
People who had no other music to conquer decided.
Right.
Right.
Anyway, that was quite amazing. I just look up the date of that piece, and Beethoven wrote it when he was 14 years old.
Oh, wow.
Okay, 1784. That was the date of the without Opus 4. Okay, so that was quite early work. But anyway, and then besides the 5 piano concerto, obviously if we go to buy a complete Beethoven piano concerto CD set, if someone still buys CD these days, it also come with one piece that include the piano, the orchestra, and the choir, the choral
the choral fantasy.
choral fantasy, which is believed to be a experiment before the writing of the Ninth Symphony, the choral symphony. Because if you listen to the choral part of that choral fantasy, if the melody goes... It actually sounds like the theme,
Right.
last move of number 9. So if we really combine all those possible numbers, that we should be talking about maybe even 7 works. But obviously, the most popular ones remain the 5 concertis for piano. So Sandy was right, because a lot of time when we talk about these 5 concerti, we somehow put them into 2 groups. The first group, I would include number 3, which adhere to the more classical concerto structure. Start with the orchestra tutti, which presents all of the themes, okay, and then the piano soloists start their part. But when we get to number 5 and number 4, number 4 and number 5, we have something totally different, because in those 2, the piano start the work. And I'm sure when I'm teaching my student, whether they're a piano student or a music theory student, I often ask them, put yourself back into the time when the piece was premiered. Okay, when people went to the concert and expect to hear a concerto, of course they expect the orchestra to start. Okay, that's number 3. But suddenly, if they hear the piano start, that's number 4. I'm sure they would be shocked, and they will probably look at each other like, "What is going on? This is not a piano."
Did we were we late? Did we come in late?
Right, exactly. So, and not to mention number 5, they start with the exuberant cadenza, okay, at the very beginning. So yeah, it is very interesting, and it really covers a lot of emotion and a lot of texture and a lot of color. For me, the most colorful one is actually number 4. Number 5, everybody knows, but number 4, it just has a very interesting color to it. At some point, it almost sounds like he inspired Schubert in many ways.
That came up last night.
Really?
Exactly. We were talking about the 10th violin sonata.
Right.
Which is separated by a time span from the other 9, which are early works, relatively early works. And this one, Ken was saying, sounds like something Schubert would write. And it's also in G major.
Oh, it's interesting because Schubert does have a G major sonata. It goes like this.
Oh.
know, that one, and then Beethoven's number 4 is. It has
Well, you
a
know,
little-
that's a good point. I've
there's a
thought
little vibe.
G major is for Beethoven is not a macho key.
No,
It's
no.
not a strong key. There's no symphony in G. There might be a slow movement in G that contrasts, but none of these powerful straight ahead first movements or last movements. And so I think for him, the ethos of that key was just more intimate
Oh,
and
no.
not as pressed for time, shall we say?
Right. Absolutely. I like that. I like that idea very much. Not a press for time, really, because it's the music melt. You melt into it, rather than it's just start. What? The E flat major ones.
Well, thank you for telling me. You know, I knew this, but I never really put it into words. It starts with the cadenza. I really knew that, but
Right. I'm sure you know.
that was absolutely. Well, I mean, that was so radical. That was beyond radical.
Oh yeah. As I said, if we imagine ourselves being in the audience when it was premiere, it is really something, and I'm sure they were shocked.
Yes, I think they were, but I think they were also like, wow. It just was a whole new way of looking at things. I can tell you, by the way, as a conductor,
Right.
there's nothing harder to conduct than Beethoven piano concertos when the soloist is coming out of a run or coming out of coming out of something that's freer, the
Right.
mini cadenzas that are in there, your heart's in your throat. And I remember at a presentation of Emmanuel Axe, where he
Yeah.
talked about this to the Conductors Guild, and he just said, I can make that easy for a conductor, or I can make that horrible. And he demonstrated both ways. And all of us, of course, were conductors leaning forward because all of us had been burned by this, usually by students at one time or another. What's the secret to nailing these runs? And he would just make it, oh my gosh, he'd be so easy to follow, or he wouldn't be easy to follow. And he had been, after a lifetime of performing and teaching, knew the differences between them and why. But I really enjoyed hearing that point made, because I know there are times, oh my gosh, I've had students playing, what was the hardest one? Hardest one would have been number 3. Some of the
The last
scales there.
movement, the
Yes,
third movement.
yes,
All
you
those
love that. Everybody loved.
interlude.
They love that movement. The students who played in the orchestra thought that was the coolest piece. And as a conductor, I'm saying, please be with me. Please be with me on these runs. Please don't make me have to guess where you're going to end.
And not to mention the fugue in number 3.
Oh, right,
Section,
right.
That is a very, very tricky part for the orchestra.
Well, yes,
No?
the tricky part is not to rush.
Right.
Tricky
I
part is
suppose
not
so.
to trip over yourself. I say this having done this with student orchestras.
I
So
see. Okay.
you know where the bodies are buried. You mentioned something, and for our audience, I'm just going to clarify. You said work without opus. And you may have, if you were looking up some of these pieces, and not just piano concertos, other works of Beethoven, and it's pretty much peculiar to Beethoven, the initials capital W and then small o and small o. Woo is what it looks like. Werk ohne Opus, meaning work without opus in German. And what that meant is that Beethoven, had very high quality controls for himself. And he would not assign an opus number. Opus means work. Opus is a way of organizing your catalog. As we get to composers like Beethoven, who use the term opus, he was among the first people to do it because Mozart didn't. And it's just, how do you organize your output? And how do you have a way of referring to it? If you've got 47 sonatas in E flat, you need a little bit more than that. And hopefully the opus system also gives you a way to indicate chronology to people who are looking at your music, because it helps them put it in some sort of chronological context of what the composer's development might be. So just just so that if you're looking for one of these pieces, if you come across that peculiar little marking, now you know what it is. And it means that Beethoven didn't feel like he wanted to say it was ready for prime time. Do I have that right, Eric?
He thought so.
Yeah, that was his. And in some cases, I'd say, wait a second, this is a perfectly good piece.
Right.
There's
Right.
some early works there that are absolutely charming. Now, one piece that he did, and I'm over to you, Odin, in just a second. One piece that he did give an opus number to, and we never hear it performed, is the transcription of the violin concerto for piano. That actually has an opus number in his catalog assigned by him. And he thought he'd done a great job of translating that music over to piano. And I don't know that the world agrees with him, otherwise we'd hear it done. But probably the more important reason we don't hear it is that we can't, I mean, you can't, where the violin concerto ends, nothing can follow. Not
Right.
a violin concerto, probably not very many pieces of music. And I feels the same way that I do about that. We're talking about the, in case you got muted in there, about how Beethoven actually gave an opus number to the transcription of the violin concerto for piano. But
What
who,
is that opus number, by the way? What
I
did he?
think it's the next one. It's like 61A or it might be 62, and I don't have the catalog out in front of me. But he actually thought it merited that. And I'm going to say, who'd want to hear it on piano after you've heard it on violin? It's just was conceived for violin, and it is the most perfect concerto. And why don't you take it from there, Odin?
Well, it's interesting that that he then wrote it for piano. I believe that he most likely composed it at the keyboard, because one of the things we commonly notice as violinists is that it's first of all, it's perfect music. It's not designed to be violinistic by any means, and there are places where it isn't violinistic. It's the way he uses disjunct thirds, the octave leaps. It's in a way almost obvious that the composer was sitting at a keyboard writing a violin concerto. It's very pianistic.
Okay, I'm thinking of the, can you see my hands at all?
Ba-ding, 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 ba-dum,
Or in the last one, you know.
Yeah, and all of the licks. It's very, very much pianistic. I would say about the concerto, which falls just after the Rasmowski quartets in chronology and represents middle Beethoven, is also late in the sense that something's eating at him, and for me it's a knocking. We start with these 5 timpani beats, the D's, that bring in the orchestra, and that 5 quarter note figure that spans 1 measure plus a quarter is repeated in quarter note fashion, 8th note fashion, 16th note fashion, even by half bars and full bars throughout the piece. And if we look at it mathematically, he's obsessed with 5s and 3s. If you listen to in the opening tutti, okay. Bum bum bum, bum bum bum, beam bum bum bum, beam bum bum bum, beam bum bum. 5. So there you had it in a very fast version, 5 beats in the opening, bum 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 bum, and then he groups these into sequences of 3s for emphasis, with the 3rd being the and this is all throughout the first movement, and even reappears in the last movement, this knocking that's happening all the time. And the other thing that's remarkable, despite that little, so that forms, in other words, when he's doing it in these different lengths, he's adjusting according to harmonic progression. So there's 3, with the last one being going through several chords at once. He also does it on individual notes, repeating the D over and over again, or in the trumpets during the G minor section in the development, when that glorious slow G minor theme comes, it's interrupted by muted trumpets reminding us of those 5 notes over and over again.
And timpani.
And timpani. So,
by the way, that's the most magical of magical moments in the whole movement for me. I love it. I mean, it's hard to pick your favorite, but that one gets me in the gut every single when he pivots, when we go to that chord, because we've been in E flat.
Right.
We're kind of noodling around in E flat there and or G minor, whatever, but suddenly we're at the 5 of D, and it's the timpani and the trumpets who can't play another, they're not fully chromatic. They don't have a whole lot of notes they can do. So they bring us back, and it's like, oh, we're back. We're
also
back.
Remarkable is that there's 64 bars of music before the violin, I believe, 64 bars of music before the violin even comes in. And you're standing there pondering the fact that you're about to have to play the hardest concerto musically of them all. And you have a solid couple of minutes there to face your demons before you even have to enter. And all of the musical figures are brought out in a traditional way, like you would see in earlier Beethoven concertos with the orchestra.
Right, double exposition.
And yet, in this piece, like the Brahms concerto, and unlike several of the piano concerti, we see the violin playing very often in all of these noodly 16th note passages or triplet 8th note passages that a sort of diva violinist would think was the important line. It's actually accompanying melodic figures that are happening in the orchestra. It's just an obligato to accompany the melodic solos that are either occurring in the winds or in the tutti strings. So very much like the Brahms concerto, I consider the Beethoven violin concerto to be more a symphony with a very prominent solo violin part. It's very symphonic writing, as opposed to a Tchaikovsky concerto, or which has both. But you're constantly reminded of how incredibly important the work is as a whole and what's going on in the orchestra in those two concertos. For me, in those two concertos, more than any others, in the Beethoven and then later in the Brahms concerto, the same issue, where whatever you think works by yourself in the practice room violinistically may not serve the line that happens in the bassoons or the winds or anything else. So the violin performances that we enjoy the most of those two concertos are inevitably the best musicians, not necessarily the most acrobatic violinists. It's whoever the most probing musician that can see where they fit into a larger whole. That work for me is remarkable that way. And I think for that reason, Beethoven concerto is very frightening to a lot of people. I had the fortune of having a teacher when I was young who gave me the concerto way too soon, but with the caveat that she said to me that I would not fully understand it musically, and we were going to use it to clean up strokes and to play very in tune and make a nice sound. But the bonus of having studied it that early was that I learned it before I knew how great it was and how scared one should be of it. And so that was and then my understanding of the work grew with the subsequent performances with orchestras. So thankfully, my fear or I should say my respect for the precise language it requires grew at the same level as my ability to somewhat approximate that, or at least come close to it. And that helped me a lot, because I have friends who didn't do their first Beethoven concerto until they were, 25 or 30, and they said they were terrified. And I had played it 15 times with orchestra by then.
Right, but you are intimidated by just what's there.
And you'd see more.
It's like somebody giving you a holy book.
If I listen to some of those old performances of Beethoven concerto of mine, I'm I feel like the gray-haired old professor saying, "What is that poor boy doing?"
Oh, and listen, I have to cut in because last night I made a comment about myself, and I said, there was a time when I was a smoking hot violin player. And I went back and I said, what possessed you to say that to people? That's never been true, and it's not true now. It's certainly not true now because I no longer really do any playing. Everything is put into the score study, but it's you're always intimidated by great music if you're smart, and if you have enough understanding to realize how much you don't know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I went back and listened to, I listened to myself playing the Kreutzer Sonata when I was a student. I had a recording of it that I pulled up, and I'm thinking, oh my God, you are not a collaborative player. You're too loud when the piano has the material. You don't know when to hold back or come to the fore. So it marks a spot on our journey. Some of us reach enlightenment earlier than others. Some of us has to fight for every bit of enlightenment as well as technique. But at the end, up there at the top of the mountain is something like the Beethoven Violin Concerto or the fourth or fifth piano concerto that will reward us for all of our work that way. I need to just break in and just remind the audience, both of our guests tonight are graduates of the Juilliard School, studied at the Juilliard School. And I do remember, if we're talking about the same teacher, I was told that the curriculum for the violin students, Beethoven came last out of all the major concertos.
Yeah. I think Galamian taught a bunch of virtuoso concertos, and he ended with Beethoven and Mozart.
Right. Okay.
Ended with those guys. The only thing that might come after that were some of the extremely modern composers, and that was because he was putting it off because he didn't like teaching it.
So, Eric, tell us, out of all those concertos, which is your personal favorite, or is it hard to decide? And that's a fine answer too.
It's a diplomatic answer. No. Well, I think for me, fun to perform number 3. I always like number 3. But musically, there are things that I must say, just like Odin said, I learned number 4, but then I just don't want to. I can't play it. I can play it for myself, but I can't. I don't have the gut to
Ooh, okay. Now we're getting in some interesting stuff here. Let
Right.
me call the therapist in.
Yeah. So, number 5, exuberant. A lot of time. I'm not saying that it is easy, but it is. It's more outward. Okay. When things are more outward, it's almost easier to play. But number 4 is so inward. I really. Well, you mentioned Brahms concerto and some other thing. My teacher did tell me once that, well, yeah, you will learn Brahms concerto, Brahms number 1, and then
At the end of
you are older, when you are 40,
you will learn number 2.
Right. Then yes, I had the opportunity to play number 1 of the orchestra when I was at Juilliard, and it was not so bad. But number 4 of Beethoven, I don't really, as I said, I don't have the gut now to play it. Yeah, I really want to make sure I guess there's no way to truly make sure if I'm ready or not. I have to just, if I had the opportunity to play that.
Okay, to our listeners who are trying to figure out why you're afraid of anything, having heard you play things like Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky, what Eric is saying is something that all of us, when we kind of finally finish our Jedi training and we reach some sort of enlightenment, realize is you need humility to approach some of these works.
Oh,
We
absolutely.
may not always have that when we're students ready to
Amen
conquer
to
the
that.
world.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have that same fear, Sandy, of the 10th sonata that you brought up. It's the most
Yes,
inward.
isn't that in a class by itself?
It's so much harder to pull off than any of the other ones. Maybe closely followed for me by the 6th sonata. Um, it, it's a type of music that, I mean, it's really gesture music. It starts with a trill and a leap up of a fourth, and then
It sounds more like a question than an answer.
it really does, and a conversation. It's very conversational between the piano and the violin, but not in a traditional. And he hides the sonata form. He conceals it. It's very concealed, so you don't know whether you're listening to sonata form or recitative, and to pull it off, and then the melodies, yum ba-dum, yum da-dum. That is Schubert. It's not what we associate with Beethoven at all. And that inwardness, and you know how outward a guy I am, is why I'm so afraid of it. I don't know what to do with myself. Sandy,
I get it. I totally.
You know how I am, very outward. So
thank you both of you for admitting these things on air for people, because so many people have had the same questions but can't even put them into words. Thank you for putting them into words. Appreciate that. And
I think I'll do it when I'm 70. I'll play it.
There you go. There you go. There you go. Beethoven, for our listeners, Beethoven, of course, his primary instrument was piano. He performed on that. His father tried to market him as a child prodigy. I remember even when I was a kid looking at Beethoven biographies in the library, they would disagree on the birth date because it went back to the time when his father had knocked 2 years off of his birth certificate in order to make him appear younger and more like the prodigy Mozart, who turned out to be a real cash cow for his father, Leopold. And Ludwig's father was hoping to cash in a similar way. So he beat the kid. He was really abused in the name of music. It's amazing. His relationship with the music itself was not perverted as a result of that process. Maybe his relationship with his father was, but not.
Oh,
not
and with humans, I mean, if listen to the raconteurs describing his relationships socially his whole life and his need to write the Heiligen song, the letter to his brother.
Heilige Stocks. Yes.
I mean, obviously, by any common analysis, it seems when we read this that we're dealing with someone that is a self-admitted sociopath, not sociopath, but unable to communicate with humans any other way than through his music.
And even the music raises so many questions. For our listeners, also, Beethoven played piano, but like most of the serious musicians of his day, he also doubled, and he was a violinist of sorts. His father started his training young, and that was all part of the let's imitate Mozart's success shtick. So he was learning how to play violin as a kid, and he was, he could get around the instrument. He, like most successful musicians of his day, understood these relationships in ways that we wind up having to teach now. Whereas these things were apparent to the musicians of the day back then, based on the experiences, the formative experiences they had. But Beethoven, also the instrument he played as a young man, he played in the Elector of Bonn's orchestra. And it's funny, we don't talk about electors except during presidential election cycles, because that's what the electoral college is comprised of. What is an elector? Well, that system comes to us from Europe. And the Elector of Bonn, and Beethoven was born and grew up in Bonn on the Rhine. He was a nobleman, a minor nobleman, and Beethoven played viola in the orchestra. And I'm always, the times that I've had a chance to play viola on pieces of Beethoven, they knocked me out how well he understood the instrument, how well he understood low close harmonies.
Yeah. and when to give them the melody, when to give them the
Yes.
juicy melody.
Yes.
Slow movement of number 5. I mean, there's so many places, but it's remarkable. Also, something jumped to my mind when you were talking about this. It was the imperfection of many artists, and Beethoven here being a specific example, to function normally in terms of expressing themselves in interpersonal relationships, maybe created a vacuum that had to be expressed through their music. And I think we've seen many artists that had these difficulties in their personal relationships and that could communicate best to the world through their music. I don't care if you're talking about Glenn Gould or Jackie Dupre or Michael Rabin, who was very awkward socially. It's Heifetz. It's almost as though there's a common thread of humans, this specific type of artist that can play in these ways that are transcendental, or compose in these ways that transcendentally move us. It's because they're saying something to us that they never could say in words. I have a little art piece that Deborah Hershey made for me, multimedia art with a quote from Hans Christian Andersen, where words fail, music speaks.
Music speaks, right?
And I feel like art and dance and even architecture, but certainly music and opera and all of these types of art forms, they all fulfill some sort of communication where language falls short. Traditional language falls short. It can't do it. And it's something common that we all can feel. You can feel it. But why can Beethoven be appreciated equally regardless of our ethnic origins or anything else? Because there's something that it says that's unspoken in human languages that we all need to feel, we all need to say, we all need to hear said. And I feel that both in terms of the great performers and the great composers, that they were trying to bring a slice of heaven or something else into this imperfect world, a sort of atonement for everything that's bad or destructive in us, and that couldn't be expressed any other way than the medium that they were using, whether it's.
No, that's Odin. That's very beautifully said. Do you have something to add, Eric?
No, I was thinking that was a very the very, very romantic idea that music express things that cannot be expressed through words. And I was also thinking, well, I was born in Hong Kong, and Chinese is my mother tongue, basically. There's a phrase we say, it strike the chord in the heart. It strike the chord in the heart. Really, it's when we were talking about Beethoven Fourth earlier. The opening was in G major, and after that opening, suddenly the orchestra come in B major. That change of tonal color, okay, there's no other word for it. That change of tonal color is so sublime. That's why I cannot describe it with words.
Happens again in the Emperor. Happens again in the Emperor Concerto.
Right.
The same one, the exact same one, right?
Goes to E flat from from one of the and then the orchestra comes in loud. Jump, 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 jump. It's just the same idea.
Yes, and speaking of harmonic languages, when at the end of the second movement of the Emperor, okay, how does he slide into the third movement? You know that every time I hear something like that, I got goosebump.
You're not alone.
I'm sure.
You're not alone. I hear you. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sing with you there, but I couldn't resist.
Right.
The marvelous thing about that is it's not even just musicians. You could take a little kid that's never had a music course before, and if they're in a great concert hall, hearing it done really the right way, and that happens, you can see them gripped. You can look at this little child's eyes at that moment, and something has gripped them.
Yeah.
It makes
And
you cry.
the key was doing it the right way.
Yeah.
Right. You know, I always look at that slow movement, Eric, as and keep thinking, it shouldn't have been written in B. It should have been written in C flat.
Uh-huh.
Not that the listener would hear it any differently, but you'd look at it in the page and say, "Whoa, oh, this is
Yeah.
as rich as you can get without going to jail. This is just, it's outrageously rich on the flat side."
Oh, yes.
And then
Yes.
we go from there to C flat to B flat, and then you're in another universe.
Right.
But
Right.
that's a magical moment. That is, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, not Mozart. I don't think Mozart did that anything quite push the envelope in that manner the way Beethoven does.
Probably.
I don't think, I mean, he does it in other ways, but not in that way. But yeah, those are instances. Or the moment that Odin mentioned about where the trumpets and the timpani come in the development section. And like I said, that to me gets me. I think I was listening to, I was hearing that in my head one night when I wasn't feeling well when I was a student, and I heard it over and over. So I must have had a fever. But we'd get to that moment and it was like an electric shock, even though it's very soft. It was a soft electric shock.
Right.
Oh my God, all the possibilities now of going back to A major, but it's not in root position. A major going to D minor, but are we in D minor? Are we what, you know, and the way Beethoven plays with us, and Odin, no matter how many times we've done that piece over and over and over and over and over with that long A and the violin's doing its cartwheels, it still is just a thrill when it finally gets there.
And then he tricks us. Dum 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 yum bum 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 bum. He overlaps those threes and fives again at the end of that, and the way that happens and the way it becomes actually, because that passage, for example, works much better with a little forward motion, but you have to slow it down to arrive at tempo primo then if you do that.
That's correct.
You have to slow the ending a little bit so that it has that majesty when the orchestra comes in. It has to still be the same tempo that those first five timpani were.
Oh, you can't hear that recap and have it sound like you fell down the stairs.
Right.
It's got to sound it's got to not just dignified, but that it answered all the questions in the world.
That's what's hard. It's like it's so romantic, and yet it's so strict in its architectural requirements.
Well, that's what when people want to debate, was Beethoven and we'll hear this debate again. I sort of, you know, even with the limitations the pandemic has placed on it, but we'll hear the debate. Was Beethoven a classicist? Was he a romanticist? I do believe he has elements of both, but his work is still got the underpinnings of the classical thinker, of the discipline that is involved in that. Because when I think of other composers who are contemporaneous with Beethoven, and you couldn't call them classical at all.
That's right. That's exactly
like Weber.
Or concurrent schools. Classicism existed as a separate school from Romantic system concurrently, and you see that later, because even if you listen to Richard Strauss's early works, like the Sonata in E flat, it's the first movement is as much looking back to classical form as it is looking ahead. Even though the last movement makes full use of short light motifs from the tone poems and everything else, it's as much looking back. And the same with Brahms. It's as much looking back as looking forward. For me, Brahms and Beethoven, and I know it's an argument that one can have forever. They're classicists that manage an incredible amount of
they're in my opinion as well. they're classicists, but they innovated in terms of, look at me, they expanded formal possibilities.
Right.
They weren't iconoclasts breaking things, and having to redo it. They sum things up.
And they learned how to use romantic license within a classical framework. So they could take the idea of these incredibly juicy lyrical melodies, and they could somehow marry that with incredible classical form. And the last of the composers to do that for me, because Mahler becomes something completely different, where he breaks all of that, and Wagner, they really break it into a new language. But the last of the ones that really reminds me of that, for all of his harmonic intricacy and secondary dominance and all of that, is Richard Strauss. There's something still classical in Strauss's music for all
I suppose you're right. I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way, and I will give that some thought. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming up to the end of the hour here, and I'm going to give both of our speakers a chance if they have any concluding remarks to make. And as always, when we do one of these, I learned so much just from listening, and you've given me new things to think about, and I think you probably impacted one another's thinking in various ways as well. I hope that our listeners have entered into this. Sometimes we get a little technical with the language, but you can see how much we are committed to this music because it means the world to us. So, Eric, would you like to, any concluding remarks about this?
Concluding remarks.
And you don't have to be profound. You can say,
listen more.
Well, and that's not a bad thing to say. I mean, I love those pieces. I love the fact that the earlier pieces are clearly works, they're an extension of what we've learned from Mozart.
Absolutely. I was just going back through the pieces in my mind, and I suddenly remember I wanted to mention one thing about number one, actually, the early work when he was 25 years old. There is one moment in the last movement. It almost sounds like
oh, wait a minute! I know the song. Yes. Tico.
Exactly.
Tico. And every time we hear that, everybody starts to dance, and
exactly.
Yes.
Something
where
like
did
that
it come from?
Yeah, exactly. It's like we were talking about he being classicist and look into the future, okay? And yeah, through all these music, we really there are always surprises. His use of course, his classicist language, okay? He brought in fugue in number 3 and fugue in late sonatas, but at the same time, as Odin was saying, all these romantic license in the classical structure, and really, the more you listen, the more you will find. The more we study, the more we will find, and I think that's what make his music great, and what make great music even greater. It's just that non-ending. There's no
exactly. Our quest can never end with these great composers. I think we would be absolutely heartbroken if it did.
Right.
We want to keep on. That's what keeps drawing us into this. Is there's still more to find. There's still more to find in a way. Oh my gosh, there's more to find. There's still more treasure in here that I may not have unearthed. And every time I do a great work as a conductor, even if I've done it over and over and over and over again, it's like, I didn't see that relationship. I didn't see how that worked. Wait a second. How did I overlook whatever it is that's just bitten me on the nose?
You just had to walk into the room for the 20th time and look. Yeah, that's like what happens with all of us. Same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I never saw that there. Was that there?
Was that there? How could I have overlooked that?
Mhm.
And you know, this keeps us honest, and it keeps us humble. And I think we need both of those things if we're going to do this work. Really, for real, we're not entertainers. We like to think of ourselves as being artists and probing, looking for deep meanings. And we're sharing this conversation with our listeners because they don't get a chance to hear it that often where they're invited in. I'm trying to make this easy to comprehend by any number of levels of experience, and just to share our enthusiasm with all of them. So Odin, give us some closing thoughts.
So the first is in response to your brilliant observation about returning to works. And that is to quote a French philosopher that I can't remember the name of just now, who said to discover is not to travel to far and distant lands, but to see with new eyes. And I think that's what happens.
Good way to put it. Thank you for that.
When we come back to old works. And the second one has to do with the saliency and of Beethoven's music to everything we're currently going through all together and by ourselves in our nation and in the world with this whole COVID crisis and everything else. And I'm reminded of Beethoven's transcendencies of his own challenges in life, both socially and physically with his hearing, and what he still managed to produce for all of us. And one of his life quotes, which was "From darkness into light." And I would encourage people that want an example of the human spirit conquering its own physical weaknesses and social weaknesses. Beethoven becomes a perfect example of how we can navigate this strange time into light again and into coming out on the other side, taking care of one another now, wearing masks, being careful, still trying to keep the world going as much as we can, but with the understanding that there is light at the end of the tunnel and that light is not necessarily a train. And that if Beethoven could do it, so can we, and maybe it will help us all to get there if we listen to a little more Beethoven.
Oh, well put. I can't follow that with anything except to say thank you to Dr. Eric Fung, to Odin Rathnam, two of my favorite soloists, and two of the premier musicians in the capital area of Pennsylvania. To those of you who are listeners, please send us your comments. Send us questions that you'd like us to explore in future presentations or topics you'd like us to explore. We're doing this because we can't be with you in person, and we want to keep the conversation about music going. You started to say something, Odin. I read it on your face.
More that I hope now, getting to meet Dr. Fung for the first time, that sometime he can help me get over my fear of the 10th sonata.
Well, you have to help him get over his fear of the 4th concerto. You'll save a lot of therapy bills if you can do that.
I'll lead you about 70 other musicians to do that.
Right, exactly. And as we get older, we have more of these fears because, as I said before, we've learned humility and we've learned an appreciation for all of the things that we don't know and that we have yet to understand. And we may never understand it all, but when we do, there's no point in living, really.
Right. And it's okay to fall off the horse. I tell my students always, it's okay to fall off the horse.
Oh, absolutely. Just get back on. Get back on the horse.
Exactly.
So, ladies and gentlemen, again, this program is in celebration, one of several we're doing in celebration of the 250th birthday of Beethoven, which will take place on December 16th. There were worldwide celebrations, and they will continue. There'll be virtual celebrations and coordinated using various technological platforms, but nothing quite like doing it together. We'll probably see makeup concerts throughout this next year, simply because we can't bear to let this opportunity for all this Beethoven sharing to go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Please share this with your friends. Please invite other listeners who might be feeling a little bit hungry for music and conversation, invite them into the fold. We're accessible on the Hershey Symphony YouTube channel. And Susan Court, when you make your final remarks, you may want to remind people how to access that. And we're going to be back. You see the hall in back of me, they're polishing the floor while we speak. They can't wait for us to be back.
The whole show, I was wondering, thinking to myself, that's so beautiful. I miss that place.
I miss that place too. We all do. We want to be on that stage. We want the audience out there in the hall of that extraordinary building with so much history. And we want to fill it with music. We want to fill it with our connections.
We will. And I have to tell you, this was so inspirational to listen to. Sandy, Eric, Odin, thank you so much. It was fascinating to listen to, because it wasn't just three very accomplished musicians talking about Beethoven. You were actually learning from each other and sharing your passion and your fears about music. And I think it was just so inspirational and very relatable for everyone. So I want to thank you.
Thanks for getting us together. It must have seemed like herding cats.
It was a little bit like that, but well worth it. Well worth it. So thank you all. And we encourage you to come back and watch more episodes of Sandy and Friends. And of course, to support your local Hershey Symphony Orchestra. Thank you and take care. Stay healthy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.